Hello, this is international football commentator Derek Ray, and a warm welcome to the KickBack FC.
What's up, y'all? Welcome to the KickBack FC. Appreciate you guys tuning in to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
All right, so welcome back to the Kickback FC, your go-to spot for unfiltered, real talk, all things soccer. We're bringing down the biggest moments, hottest takes, and everything you need to stay plugged into the world's game. We'll even tap into other sports from time to time because if it's big in sports, we've got thoughts on it. Whether this is your first time with us or you've been rocking with us from the jump, again, I just want to say thank you to all of our friends and supporters. Once again, my name is Cornelius. I'm one of your co hosts. I'm here with my boys and fellow co hosts. Gabriel, how are you feeling today?
Not too bad, man. I feel good. Have a very esteemed guest on with us today, so very excited to jump into the story. Mike, how you feeling?
I'm feeling great, man. It's a Monday and I don't have to work, so I have no complaints. How about you, Salam?
I'm good. I'm really excited to be here with you guys and our guest today, Cornelius.
Over the moon, man. I'm very happy to sit down with our guest today. Salam, take it away.
Sounds good. Today we're speaking with one of the most respected voices in global football. Whether it's Bundesliga nights, FIFA World Cups, or EAFC commentary, he's brought matches to life with storytelling, accuracy, and global perspectives. Derek Ray, welcome to the Kickback FC. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's always a great pleasure to be able to talk about the sport that I think, more than any other sport, unifies the world. So here we go. I'm fascinated to hear your perspectives as well.
Nah, absolutely. So to kick things off, obviously we're going to get into your illustrious career, but you're a proud Scot, as I've often
Yes.
heard you say. You grew up in Aberdeen. You born in the late '60s. So actually, I want to start there. I want to start with what it was like growing up in Aberdeen, especially at a time where you're a young lad and Sir Alex is starting to get his managerial career started. So what was it like growing up in Aberdeen, starting with the time when Sir Alex was a manager there, and then how he kind of grew that team into what it was, European champions, and then so on and so forth.
Yeah, great starting point. By the time Sir Alex, we just knew him as Fergie back then, became Aberdeen manager, I was already a Dons fan, the Dons being the nickname of the local team. And it was more or less the case that that's who you supported. If you came from Aberdeen, city of around 200,000 on the North Sea coast, fairly grey city, quite windy a lot of the time with the sea breeze and everything. And the oil industry was coming to be at that particular time. Previously, it had been all about the fishing industry in Aberdeen. But we landed Alex Ferguson. And at the time, I don't think we knew how good it was going to be. He'd been the manager of St Mirren. He had left St Mirren in fairly acrimonious circumstances, but Aberdeen got him. And at that point, Aberdeen were sort of a team on the rise. They'd always had their moments in Scottish football. They had won things, but you never quite knew from one season to the next whether they'd be competing for a cup or, maybe to be second or third in the league or perhaps to try to avoid relegation. It was very much up and down. But then Ferguson came in, and it took him a while, but once he got to grips with it, then there was no stopping him. And Aberdeen in that period, if you sort of look at the history books from the late 70s, especially going into the 80s, you could make a pretty ironclad case that they were the best team in Europe for a period of time. And I'm talking about 1983, 1984. So you can imagine what it was like. As you said, I was born in the late 1960s. I grew up following Aberdeen and started to make my own fledgling commentaries on a stereo cassette recorder when it was, 8, 9, 10, and then into my teens would take this little portable tape recorder with me to Pittodrie Stadium, the local stadium for first team games and for reserve team games. And so I lived that era with Alex Ferguson. And, I think the big changes that we've seen in football are numerous. Back then, we were talking about a team of 11 Scots that could go and beat any club side in Europe. And if you look at 1983, which is the year that every Aberdeen fan goes back to because that was special. Aberdeen won the Cup Winners' Cup, which doesn't exist anymore, but back then was more or less seen as the second most important European trophy and a very close second to the European Cup. There wasn't that big divide along the lines of what you have now between Champions League, Europa League, Conference League, as we have it now. The Cup Winners' Cup was pretty special. And Aberdeen beat Bayern at the quarter-final stage of that competition, 0-0 away. They were trailing 2-1, went on to win 3-2, and then they beat Real Madrid, small matter of Real Madrid, in the final, and then were to beat Hamburg over 2 legs to win the European Super Cup a few months later. So it was an incredible time. I don't honestly think at that point, I was 16 when it happened, 1983. I don't think we realized just how once in a lifetime this was, because you know what it's like. When you're 16 and you've had success, you think, okay, this is it. This is us for life. And I think people now, looking back, who maybe read about Aberdeen would think, how on earth could that have happened? But it seemed fairly normal at the time. And of course, we have Alex Ferguson to thank to a large part for those years of success in Aberdeen.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great perspective. I honestly didn't know much about the club until, Sir Alex had his documentary that dropped a few years back. And obviously, I'm a Chelsea fan as well, but you have to respect, you got to respect Fergie and everything he's done for the game. And so that's when I was kind of like, oh, this is a big manager. I mean, in his young days, just starting off, you're beating European giants like Bayern Munich and Real Madrid. Take us through that run a little bit. You said you're 16 years old. You're seeing your small club, take on these giants. What was that like during that time?
Well, it was a dream come true, because I remember that campaign started with a game against Sion of Switzerland. Aberdeen actually had to play a preliminary round game just to get into the first round proper. And of course, it was a smaller competition in terms of who you had to beat. You didn't have group stages the way you do now. It was straight knockouts, and you keep on winning, then you keep on going. And they thrashed Sion, put 7 past them and 1 convincingly away from home as well. And then they had a bit of a tough nut to crack in Dinamo Tirana from Albania. And I'll never forget that game, because Aberdeen were well on top but just couldn't score, only scored 1 goal. And we wondered, would it be enough to actually see them through? Now, the great adventure of the time, of course, call it an adventure, it was also a political reality, not a very pleasant one, was that you had to go behind the Iron Curtain. Again, for people who are younger, they'll think, well, what's the Iron Curtain? Well, part of Europe at that point, you had the Eastern Bloc and the West, and so Aberdeen had to go to Albania, which was then a communist country, and playing in pretty unfavourable conditions. There were actually reports of a coup going on, an attempted coup at the time, and it was a really tricky game. They got through it with a 0-0 draw, having not played all that well, but happy to be through it. Then they played Lech Poznan from Poland, who were a good side, probably similar in stature to Aberdeen at that point, but they beat them pretty easily. And then you had a bit of a break until you came to the quarterfinals. For Aberdeen to be in a European quarterfinal was remarkable in itself, not something that we had tasted. But I'll never forget those Bayern games, because obviously as a German student at the time, somebody who was learning German and was my favorite subject in school, this was the ultimate dream to have my club play Bayern. And Aberdeen went there and drew 0-0, and this was a Bayern side with legends, like Paul Breitner, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, players of that stature. Aberdeen went toe-to-toe with them, probably should have beaten them in Munich, but had to settle for 0-0. And then the famous game at Batodre, and I sort of hinted at it earlier, they were 2-1 down and heading out, because in those days you had the away goals rule, so they had to win 3-2. And there's a great moment in that game. I would urge everybody just to Google it, have a look at the highlights of what happened. And Ferguson, who we've rightly praised, he used something that we had seen before, maybe a few months before. But these, of course, were the days before there was intricate analysis of what teams did. And they had this free kick routine that they saved for special occasions. And essentially you had a little fiery player, Gordon Strachan, had the fiery red hair, tiny little midfield player, very skillful. And he and one of the other players, either John McMaster or Peter Weir, would stand together when it was a free kick just outside the box. And you would think, okay, there are only so many ways you can take a free kick outside the box. Usually you'd go for goal. But what they did was, and it's really clever, Strachan would run over the ball, and then either Weir or McMaster would then run over the ball, and they would make it look as though they had made a complete mess of this free kick routine. So Strachan would wave his arms around frantically and quite dramatically, lulling the opposition into a completely false sense of security, thinking that they had messed it up. But they hadn't messed it up at all, because what he would do was he would then just swivel around, chip it into the box, and somebody would head it home. And that's what happened in that game. You can see Alec McLeish rising into the heavens in Aberdeen, nodding it home for 2-2, and just a few seconds later, they were to make it 3-2 through John Hewitt. And it's funny, I remember about 20 years later watching a Manchester United game, and Manchester United did the same free kick routine. And I remember reading on social media people saying, oh, that's amazing. I've never seen that before. And of course, every Aberdeen fan said, yeah, we remember it from 1983 and before that as well. So that was incredible. They beat a team called Waterschei in the semi-final, Belgian side, who were good at the time, but have since fallen into more difficult times. And then Real Madrid in Gothenburg, one-off game. Real Madrid really wanted to win that trophy. Why? Because they'd never won the Cup Winners' Cup. It was the one European trophy and remains that one coveted trophy that they never got to win. And the legendary Alfredo Di Stefano was their manager. Fergie played all the politics in the world. He presented him with a bottle of whiskey before the game. He tried to sort of pretend that they were just little, Scottish Johnny-come-latelys who had no business being on the same pitch as Real Madrid. But there is a story, I don't know how true it is, that the Aberdeen players in the tunnel, as they were about to come out, it was a rainy night in Gothenburg in Sweden, very much a Scottish sort of night, so Aberdeen felt at home. But the players who had false teeth, and quite a few of them had false teeth in those days, would take their false teeth out and basically look at the Real Madrid players and sort of, almost in Braveheart fashion, sort of open their mouths as if to say, yeah, come and beat us if you can tonight, son, Very Scottish. Aberdeen, again, if anybody wants to go back and watch it, they played Real Madrid off the park over the course of 120 minutes. But of course, it was very dramatic because it went to extra time, and a local boy, couldn't write this any better, John Hewitt, came on as a substitute and scored what still, I will always see in my better dreams at night, rising up and meeting a cross from Mark McGee on the left. And just the sort of thing as a youngster that makes you go, my goodness, there is no better feeling. And I would say that for a provincial club like Aberdeen, and that's what we were. We weren't a team, even in the Scottish context, like Celtic and Rangers with a tradition of winning things regularly. For a provincial club and a fan of a provincial club, it gets no better than that.
No, I love to hear that, that perspective, especially hearing the game within the game, hearing players taking out their teeth in the tunnel, hearing Sir Alex preventing you with a bottle of whiskey saying, hey, we come in peace. It's fun to hear those stories because, you need that little bit of luck. And I feel like you guys had all the luck going into that run. But you said something that I kind of want to go back to. You talked about how, you were a German student at the time, you're learning German, and you're also recording games at the same time. So I kind of want to go back to what led you to start recording games? Did you always know you wanted to get into broadcasting, or was this something that, you just started to do as a hobby? What was the meaning behind all that?
It was a complete hobby to begin with. It all started in 1974, which I can remember vividly. I was 7 years of age. It was my first World Cup watching on television. And of course, it was in West Germany, which, in those days you had West Germany and East Germany, and both were competing, in fact, against each other, played against each other in that World Cup. So this was, the world of international football being open to me for the first time, and the world of Germany too. And so I imbibed it all. I watched every game with my father. We watched the matches together. I was utterly obsessed with that World Cup, and I think people are like that, young people especially. The first World Cup is always dear to the heart in a way that other World Cups are never going to be. And it will always be that way for me. And so it got me sort of obsessed, not just with international football, Scotland were playing in it and actually were the only team in that World Cup to be undefeated, yet didn't make it out of the group. That's sort of been Scotland's story in most tournaments they've been in. They haven't quite had the luck. Even West Germany, who won it, did actually lose to East Germany in one of their games, but they still won the World Cup. But it was to spawn really interest in German language and culture. I wanted to know everything about every German city. I would constantly say to my father, where is Dortmund? Where is Frankfurt? What makes it special? And luckily at school in Scotland in those days, we learned languages from a young age. And I knew that a year down the line, I would either be in the German class or the French class. And it was pot luck, really. It depended on the luck of the draw. Luckily for me, I was in the German class and found that it spoke to me very quickly, that I really enjoyed it. I really liked the discipline of it. I liked the sounds. There were actually some of them quite similar to the sounds that we make organically in Scotland, sort of the sound and the R sound and things like that, the U sound, which is, very Scottish as well. But in tandem with that, I was a big fan of radio. And this, again, was way before internet was invented. But I used to have an old-fashioned radio, and I would play around with the dial. And because we were right on the North Sea, in the old days, you would have had waterways rather than roadways. And, boats would have gone Aberdeen to Hamburg, fairly clear run, North Sea being, where we were. So we could actually pick up the radio signal from Hamburg every day. And I got into the habit, once I started learning German, of listening to it. So, I was a bit of a strange sort of 8 or 9 or 10-year-old. I had this knowledge of German music and news that was happening in Germany. People would say, how do you know this? Where do you get this information? And so I listened to NDR radio from Germany, and I'd fall asleep at night to a program called Das Nachtprogramm der ARD, the night program of all the combined German radio stations. I'd listen to the Bundesliga. So this was, again, my football passion coming together with my passion for German language and culture.
Sure,
I realized that I could listen to the Bundesliga. My goodness, hallelujah. This was wonderful. I could listen to the Bundesliga in my free time. And it was a bit like my sort of secret world, if you like. So I was recording things. I was listening to things. What I didn't know at the time was, and I think this is the sort of advice I try to pass along to young aspiring broadcasters, what I didn't know was I was actually building my own body of work, and I was doing it in my own time. There was no rush to do it. I was doing it organically. And that's what I think people who want to get into broadcasting need to know. You do have to build your own body of work, but you can do it in your own time, and you should do it in your own time and at your own pace. And there's a lot to be said for that. I think people often think, oh, well, who's going to give me an opportunity? And I always say, well, you can give yourself the opportunity. You can make a lot of content just for your own pleasure and, for your own critique as well. You can go back and have a listen. And that's what I did. I would make these recordings, go back and listen, and a lot of the time think, oh, yeah, I quite like that. And then think, oh, no, I could have done that better. So that's how I went about it as a very young person.
No, I think we can take to that because, we started this, this platform during COVID just as a way for us to talk to each other, because we were all in different cities and we all had a group chat where we're talking soccer anyway, but it's just like, hey, let me see your face, and we went a whole year with recording before releasing any episodes, kind of just to figure out what our voice was, our style, how we, go back and forth, the banter. And so I really respect you saying that because I feel like there is, you do get something in just kind of building that resume on your own. And, you were fortunate enough to get your break at 19, so kind of how did that start? Before I pass it on, my last question is, how did that start? And talk a little bit about David Francie. I've heard you speak about him and giving you that opportunity. Just kind of how did that all come about?
Well, thanks for mentioning David Francie, who for me will always be the legendary Scottish football commentator. I think if you want to get into broadcasting, and I hear this from people in the USA as well, you always have one broadcaster who you really look up to and you think, okay, yeah, he does it right. He does it the way that I think it should be done. And so what happened was to sort of continue that story and then get to when I was 19. I was making these tapes and one day decided I was going to send one off to David Francie, who was the voice of Scottish football at the time. Had a very, very distinctive delivery and sounds, very sort of guttural sounds. To me, he just sounded like Scottish football. And so I sent him one of my tapes thinking I'll never hear back from him. But lo and behold, about 3 or 4 weeks later, I got this beautiful handwritten letter back from him. And I must have read it about 500 times after I got it. I couldn't believe that David Francie had actually written back to me. And essentially he said, interested to hear your work. It sounds really promising. Here are a few tips. And actually some of the tips that he gave me, I still use to this day, tips really to get your voice ready for a big broadcast. And, one of the ones he gave me he said one of his routines was to say before every game very quickly, the valiant Italians buried their valuables in a canal in the valley. Say that many times over. It gets your voice in a nice sort of rich way of avoiding any tongue twisters or things like that. So anyway, a long story short, we kept in touch. He suggested hospital radio would be a good grounding for me because that's something that exists in Scotland. It's basically a service for people in hospital and a voluntary service. So it was a good chance for amateur broadcasters to get more experience. And
Sure.
I was given the chance to broadcast the football from Batodry into the hospitals. So did that for a while, kept on doing it, went to university, studied German, sent in another tape to David Francie at 19. And this time, and it tells you a lot about the man, instead of just writing back and giving me more advice, he passed it along to his boss. And his boss was a guy called Charles Runcie at the BBC. And before I knew it, I had a letter from Charles Runcie, who I didn't know, saying, come down to Glasgow, would love to meet with you sometime. David passed along your tape. We like what we hear. Let's have a chat. So I did that, not knowing what it would lead to. But what it led to was within the space of a few weeks, I was on air as a professional for the first time with BBC. And a lot of it was because David himself, David Francie, was suffering from knee trouble and needed some work done on his knee. And so they required a commentator to fill in and do some games. So my first actual live commentary, was a game between Kilmarnock and Dumbarton at the age of 19. So I'll always be grateful to Kilmarnock. That's where I got my start. So I thought, did the game, thought it went pretty well. Aberdeen to Kilmarnock is about 3.5 hours. Made my way back up by train to Aberdeen. And there was a message when I got home. Could you call Charles Runcie? So I thought, okay, let's find out. Maybe he didn't like it. So called him and he said, well done today. Now I have to ask you, are you ready for your second assignment? And I asked, what is the second assignment? And he said, the second assignment would be, we would send you to Wembley this midweek to cover England against Scotland, the oldest international in world football. So that was my second game. These were radio games. So second game on the radio was England against Scotland. And so that was 1986 at 19. And here we are. And I hadn't thought about this until actually somebody reminded me about it the other day. Come April of next year, it'll be 40 years on the air for me as a professional football commentator.
That's incredible.
And so it all goes back to those days. And I do have David Francie to thank because, it's remarkable. You have somebody who you idolize, and then that particular person actually helps you, in a very meaningful way, get started as a professional.
That's an incredible story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's amazing. Being able, just that journey of, you starting at 7, in having kind of that mindset of, I love this language. I have an idea of I want to broadcast, and then fast forwarding it to 19, and you're just sending tapes, not thinking anything's going to come of it, but then finally you do finally get that big break, especially with a England versus Scotland, at Wembley, 60,000 people, screaming fans. That's an amazing break. I definitely want to talk a little bit about that because you talk a lot about, your preparation, even from when you're 7 years old, of being, hey, this is somewhere where I think I want to take this avenue, and you calling games and recording games and just critiquing yourself, just listening to you speak on different platforms, and reading up on you as well. Your preparation for the Bundesliga is quite interesting and quite like no other, if I'm being completely honest. I've even heard you saying that, you've gone into local pubs and taken the same train stations or take the same trains and things of that sort, just to, kind of deeper that connection with the fans and the audience that you're going to connect with and speak to during that broadcast. Kind of walk me through, your pre-match process, and how did you come up with the idea of, what, I kind of want to be in the trenches with these fans, going to the games just to learn more about, that club.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I
Mhm.
think that if you're going to do commentary properly, I'm a big believer that you do have to have had the experience of being there yourself. I mean, we can all commentate as commentators on, what's happening between the white lines during a football game. That's presumably what we do as commentators. But I think to take it to the next level, what we should really want to do is put the fan, the viewer, in the stadium and inform that fan as to what it's really like. So, especially in Germany, because it's the football that I cover week in, week out, and these days spend a big chunk of my professional life going from one German city to another, one German stadium to another. I think it's incumbent upon us to try to go that extra mile and to try to make it a cultural experience as well. And of course, a lot of it happens organically with me because
Mhm.
when I'm not commentating, if I have a free Sunday, then I'll try to go to a game. And I'll try to usually go to a game in a city or a stadium I haven't been to before. There aren't that many now, though. I've been able to tick most of them off the list.
Right.
But I think it does really help you as a commentator if you can talk knowledgeably about little things like, what is special in Bochum, for example? What makes it tick? What is this Bermuda Triangle they talk about? If anybody doesn't know, the Bermuda Triangle, Bermuda Dreieck in Bochum is where all the nightlife happens, where all the lively bars are, and that's
That's
where the
good to
fans
know
go.
for my next German trip.
There you go. If you ever end up
Yeah.
in Bochum, you'll get a very warm welcome in the Bermuda Dreieck. So I think these things are for me quite important because I love German football culture, not just what happens in a game, but the stuff around it. And I love explaining why, to me, that is special and why Germany has, on average, the best attendances anywhere really in world football. So I like to try to put that into context. It doesn't happen by accident. A lot of it has to do with 50+1 and the way things are organized, but that requires explanation. Other things like, in America and the USA, I think the majority of people, when they go to a sporting event, they drive and they park their cars. Well, in Germany, that doesn't happen. Some people might, but we all jump onto the train and off on the same train, and we see other fans of the two different clubs, and there's a bit of mingling and sometimes banter, sometimes not. But that's part of the sort of the communal experience of being a fan in Germany. And again, the public transport is part of your match ticket in most cases. So you're not actually paying for it. You just say pile onto the trains and onto the tram and onto the bus. And the conversations are fascinating on public transport going to a game. Or even if you just choose to walk, as a lot of fans do. You'll sometimes see fans walking the 2 or 3 kilometers from the center of a city to the stadium. So I think all these things, whether it's that, whether it's the food in the different regions of Germany, which I like to talk about as well, because contrary to what a lot of people think, people don't eat exactly the same thing in Munich that they might in Köln or in Hamburg. It's a big country with differences, regional differences, city differences, differences in language and in dialect and things like that. And I feel that is part of my job as a commentator and somebody who's been lucky enough down the years to be at all of these venues in different contexts. It's incumbent upon me to be able to try to tell that story as well as what's happening on the football pitch.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, you talked about a little bit earlier, coming up on 40 years. I think that just speaks to, how well you're able to, tell that story to the fans and to the listeners. Kind of wanted to talk about, just your commentary style. I would love to get your opinion on what do you think your commentary style is. And I have another question on top of that, but I want to ask that first.
What do I think my commentary style is?
Hmm?
Well, I think hopefully, if I'm having a good day, hopefully it's one that will, let's put it this way, one that is aimed at leaving the viewer a little bit more educated without necessarily beating them over the head with it. I'm always happy when somebody will say to me after a commentary, "Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that about the city of Frankfurt until you mentioned it. I didn't know about the forest that you walk through en route to the stadium until you spoke about that. I'd love to experience that. With all the bratwurst stalls and beer stalls on the way as you walk in." I think I try to not over talk. I think that's something that I've always been conscious of as a TV commentator. It was sort of drummed home to me when I was at the BBC in my younger days that the maxim should always be mention things that the viewer can't see as opposed to stating the obvious. It's not radio, so the game would still go on without a TV commentator. Not the case on radio. Without a commentator, there is no event on radio. But our job on TV is more to sort of be a soundtrack, to be an intelligent soundtrack, to be one that's there, but never overpowering the game, because the game is what people are tuning in to see. They're not necessarily tuning in to hear me. Hopefully I can enhance the experience. I can also ruin it. I can ruin it for a lot of people. Every commentator can ruin it for people watching. So we have to straddle that fence a little bit. The right level of excitement, but knowing when less is more, I think, is the big key. But at the same time, I do pay a lot of attention to the words I use, so not just saying the first thing that comes into my head, but having a sort of an editorial sense as you go that, that's the right way to phrase it. And this is the good thing about TV. You always can count to 2 or 3 before you open your mouth, and I would say that to any young aspiring broadcaster. Always give yourself the 2 or 3 seconds to do that. Don't feel it has to be constant verbiage. So that's what I try to do. I try to inject a little bit of humor, but not too much of it, because I'm not a comedian. I do not make my living as a comedian. So if something is funny, I might remark upon the humor that's there, but I try not to make it about me in that sense, because, as I said, I hope most people would see me as a very poor excuse for a comedian. That's not what I do. So, I think you play to your strengths as a commentator. That's what I try to do. I try to enjoy it, but at the same time, I enjoy it more after it's over, because I'm giving everything during the game. It is work, but I'm trying to give my best for the person watching, and that sometimes means saying less. That sometimes means stepping back and knowing when to step back. So it's about striking the balance. But I think if you talk to other commentators, and I'm certainly like this, we are our biggest critics. We are very critical of our own work. And I'll come off the air not really knowing if I've done a good job, if I've done my best job, or if it could have been better. And that's just, I think, the nature of the job. You put everything into it and you hope it works, but you never quite know.
Right. No, absolutely. One thing that you said that really resonated with me, and just the different types of commentary between, the commentary in the States and then commentary in the UK is one big thing is the pauses and the breaks that you give during the matches. That's one I would say one downside to commentary in the US is that I feel like there's not much of a break. There's just continuous talking and verbiage where, as if someone scores, you give them that 2, 3, 4 seconds maybe to let the fans celebrate, to let everyone in the world celebrate and kind of get their emotions out before you re-enter the picture. And that also kind of gives you a little bit of time to figure out what you're going to say and how you want to capture that moment for the fans as well. So I do resonate with that, and I definitely appreciate it as a fan. um, that kind of leads me to my next question, though, is do you consider yourself a poet? And I asked another broadcaster this, and they said no. But in my personal answer is I think so, yes, the way you're able to string words together and the way you're able to, vividly paint that picture for someone over radio or someone, not being able to visually see the match. But I'd love to get your opinion. Do you think you're a poet yourself?
Um, I wouldn't consider myself to be a poet, no. When I
Okay.
think about the great poets, and I marvel at their ability to come up with words, come up with poetry in its purest form. I'm not sure I'm on that level. Hopefully my words are acceptable, and hopefully they match. That's what I think most of the time. I want my words to match. I don't want to, use too many words when they weren't necessary. At the same time, the one thing that I do try to work on all the time is having a nice range of adjectives to sum up a particular situation. I think it's something that our education in the UK helps us with. I think there was a lot of time spent when we were a lot younger on adjectives and adverbs. I get the feeling in the USA less so, because when I hear, counterparts broadcasting football or any sport, to be honest, in the USA, I don't hear as many adjectives, which, again, maybe just comes down to people's preferences and things like that. But no, if somebody else wanted to say you're a poet, then I would say, okay, thank you very much. That's really nice of you. But no, I would never say that about myself.
Yeah, no, fair enough, fair enough. I just wanted to hear your take on that. Another thing that you mentioned was, and one thing that you're really, really big on is pronunciation of names.
Yes.
I myself, my brother Cornelius as well. We have the last name Kiwu, and we've heard every which way incorrectly of saying our last name. Pawu, Peiwu, so many different, there's so many different ways. But I've listened that, you really take pride into the right pronunciation of names. Kind of just walk me through, your process with that and why that's so important to you.
Well, I think it really started when I was studying German, and I would listen to commentators on TV in the UK if, say, West Germany or East Germany were involved in an international tournament, and I would hear the names being wrongly pronounced. And of course, I knew they were being wrongly pronounced because I was a German speaker at that point. And it got me thinking about, maybe a lot of names are being wrongly pronounced. And it turned out that actually even names of English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish footballers were being mispronounced. There's a fellow Scottish player whose name is Graham Souness, and still around, quite a well-known pundit in the UK as well, was a very good footballer, became a manager. And if you go back and listen to the first couple of years when he played in English football, he was referred to as Graham Souness, Souness with the goal. Totally wrong, And so I think these things added up in my head, and I thought, well, if I can get these names right, why wouldn't I want to get them right, Right. It's a matter of basic respect. And so I do think, though, that the German language factor was very big in my mind and wanting to get these things right. And so, yeah, it sort of moved on from there. And I've always had these standards, when I've covered World Cups and European Championships. If it's a language I don't speak, I think back to the 1994 World Cup, and in that World Cup, 1998 World Cup I'm thinking of, and in that World Cup covering Saudi Arabia, and I don't speak Arabic. So I remember thinking, what do I do? This was earlier in my career. You didn't have easy access to things like that on the internet and trying to get pronunciations. So I thought, what do I do? Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'll call the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. Wow. And I did that. Wow. And got a very helpful press officer who took me through all the names. And so I did that for a spell. I don't do that so much nowadays because there's not really the need to. It's easier to find out now. Sometimes it's difficult to find out. You do have to go to a very good source. But I brought this with me to the video game, which was called FIFA when I started, is now EAFC. When they approached me to work on that, I said to them up front, I said, you do realize that I'm probably going to be pronouncing some names in a different manner to some of the other commentators. And they said, that's one of the reasons why we brought you on board, because we do want you to be yourself and to do that. And a good example is, I was doing his name long before he became a well-known player in England, Bruno Fernandes. That's how he says his name. Not Bruno Fernandes, Bruno Fernandes. So he goes to England, and a decision is made that that's not how commentators are going to say his name. Listen, fair enough. I can only do me. I can only do what I do. And I was calling him Bruno Fernandes before he ended up on English shores. So, again, I try to work on that basis. And it was sort of, sometimes you doubt yourself as a commentator. Sometimes you think, am I really doing this the right way? Am I just sounding odd by pronouncing a name in a manner that is different, even though it's correct? But what really brought it home to me was I was working in Scotland back around, I'm going to say 13 years or so ago now, and there was a player who had joined Dundee United, one of the clubs I was covering. And one of the great benefits of working in a place like Scotland is you have access to the tunnel area. You can pretty much talk to all the players as they come in. You can introduce yourself. And most of them will sort of have an idea who you are because they're all watching the games themselves. And there was a new player, and he wasn't a completely new player. He'd played in Scottish football before. He'd gone off to England. He was a French-born player of Moroccan origin. And everybody had been calling him Farid El Alagoui. So it's Alagui, Alagoui. So I thought, I don't think that's right. And I asked him this. I said, is that right? And he said, no. He said, everybody's been saying my name wrong. He said, it's Alagui, El Alagui. And I said, okay. I said, well, I'm going to call you that tonight. He said, thank you. He said, it's actually great. He said, my father is visiting. He's back in London and is watching. So that will be great. So, called him that. I think one or two people even said to me on social media, you're calling him the wrong name, which is often the danger when you have the right name, but the name has been wrongly pronounced for a long time. So nothing happened after that until a few weeks later, I bumped into Farid again, and he had a big smile on his face, and he shook me by the hand, and he said, thank you. He said, my father heard it. He said, brilliant. He said, thank you for being the first person to get my name right. And that made me, I think it boosted my confidence a little bit, because I thought, yeah, I'm not alone here. I'm actually doing the right thing, and it does make your life more difficult as a commentator. I won't deny that, because you constantly have to justify it to people if they haven't heard it pronounced that way before. But the fact of the matter is we all have names, and you mentioned that. You have your names, and it's nice when they're pronounced properly. If somebody in another country, and I travel a lot, if somebody called me Derek Rai, I would say, no, it's Derek Ray, it's not Rai. Okay, and they would presumably get it right thereafter. So it's a small thing, but it's actually a very big thing. We all have our identities. We all have names that are part of who we are. And we should do our utmost as commentators to get these names right.
Yeah, no,
I
absolutely.
want
And
to
I
say
think
something
that,
quick before you go, Gabriel. I just
yeah,
wanted to say something real quick. The Bruno Fernandes.
Yeah,
Yes.
well done.
I mean, that's a name that I feel like a lot of people got wrong. And I mean, when he first came to United, ASAP, I ran to FIFA, went to try and play with him on the team now. And I remember hearing you say his name, pronounced the right way. And at the time I was thinking like, oh man, Derek got this one wrong. But no, I mean that's very insightful because I mean I think that matters. That's their identity, and it's important that we that we recognize them as such.
Yeah, it's one of these things that, to be honest, I think sometimes agents are to blame for this, because I have an example of this from a player who joined Arsenal, who'd been playing in the Bundesliga. I think what happens is they convince their clients that when they go into the English language market, they need to have a name that everybody can pronounce because it's much more marketable. There was a player, you might remember him, when he was in Germany, he actually had two pronunciations. One was the Bosnian pronunciation, and one was the German pronunciation. So in German, it was Sead Kolasinac. And in Bosnian, it was, you might remember the player.
yeah, that's my
Yeah,
guy.
Bosnian,
I'm an
because he
Arsenal
was
fan.
of Bosnian parentage, Sead Kolasinac. And he actually gave an interview where he said it's either because as far as Bosnian people are concerned, it's this. As far as German people are concerned, and I grew up in Germany, it's that. He said, but the one name I really hate, gets on my nerves, is Kolasinac. So what happens? He joins Arsenal. Presumably an agent had told him you have to make it easy for people. He gave an interview, and at the end they asked him, what is the pronunciation of your name? And he said, Kolasinac. When he had a few months earlier said, I hate when people say that. So I think sometimes it's not the player's fault. But what I would say with Bruno is He's been very consistent. If you ever hear, and there are
Mhm.
loads of little clips downloaded
Yeah.
of him saying his own name, he will never describe himself as Bruno Fernandes. Never. Only Bruno Fernandes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that speaks also, going back a little bit to, your commentary style. Like a lot of commentators and a lot of broadcasters sometimes don't go the extra mile to, say the correct pronunciation and want to appeal to the to the bigger markets and to, to the masses. But I think that just, speaks to your style and, who you are as a person. I definitely do appreciate that. Um, One thing I do want to ask you just before I hand it off to one of the other guys, you've commented a lot in Bundesliga, but also you've done World Cups, you've
Yeah.
done EAFC, so many different things. What are some of the, I would say, differences that you found broadcasting in so many different markets, or is commentary for you, just strictly commentary and it really doesn't change that much for you?
I think what changes is what I said earlier on, just the context, the cultural context. So Bundesliga is what I do week in, week out,
Mhm.
and German Cup, and obviously working in Germany a lot. But I, from time to time, will do La Liga. It's not the first league that I do, but I might do, 10 to 15 games from La Liga every season. And what I have to do with La Liga is that the football looks after itself. Obviously, you do your homework on the teams, but I do have to sort of read up a lot more on cultural things and on things that are happening week in, week out in Spanish football. So I think that's the big transition. It's much easier if you are focusing on one particular form of football. I mean, when I think about most of my colleagues, most of the people who I've known since I started out in commentary, most of them are in England and their bread and butter is the Premier League. And that does make life easier because you are watching and referring to the same teams all the time. I have that advantage with the Bundesliga as well. In my spare time when I'm not commentating, say I'm not doing the Bayern or the Dortmund game that week, you can be sure that I'm watching Bayern and Dortmund, or Dortmund either live or on delay later on to make sure I'm fully, abreast of the situation with regard to those two big clubs in Germany. I think the challenge does come when you're broadcasting a big international tournament. For example, I was doing the FIFA Club World Cup for HBS, the host broadcaster, sending the world's feed to countries around the globe. And that becomes a big challenge because you are commentating on clubs you don't normally see. And this was an extra big challenge, I would say, because the squads were quite bloated. They were allowed to have 35 players, and some of the clubs decided to bring 35 players, and you had the ability to sign players even during the tournament, which is quite unusual.
Wow.
So that was quite a big research challenge, I would say, compared to most. But you throw your all into it, and I think you have to love the digging as a football commentator. The finished product is what happens during the 90 minutes, but that's really the sort of the icing on the cake, because all the ingredients that go into actually making the cake, you're talking about several days working away with your scribbles, in my case with my scribbles anyway. I've already started doing that for the new season, because once it gets going in Germany, I'll have about 9 games in 15 days, and you can't possibly start from scratch going into the first game and expect to have it all done for a 9 game in 15-day stretch. So you have to do a lot of it ahead of time. So the preparation is a big part of it. And it's getting your head into it, and you need to get to the point. It's a bit like studying for an exam. The exam is when the game comes around, and really when that game comes around, it all has to be up here in the brain rather than on a sheet of paper.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One more question before I pass it off to Mike. What's maybe one or two names that we're still pronouncing incorrectly, that of players that right now that we pronounce incorrectly, that you have? I know you have the correct pronunciation of.
Well, maybe actually just sort of say, first of all, I really hope, and I'm fully confident, but I really hope that the new playmaker for Liverpool, who I've watched a lot over the last few years and is a fabulous footballer, I hope that, as David said properly now, he's in English football. and that would be Florian Wirtz. So
Yes.
I hope everybody says
Wirtz.
Wirtz, and it's not that
Wirtz,
difficult to
okay.
say, but sometimes if it starts on the wrong footing, then it never gets corrected. So that's an easy one. I think, to be honest, I keep going back to Portuguese, which is a language I don't speak fluently, but have a lot of respect for. I love the way it sounds. And for whatever reason, in English, there's a tendency to want to pronounce Portuguese names as though they are Spanish names. So you can go down the list, pretty much anybody whose name ends in ES, for example, it's Nuno Mendes and not Nuno Mendes. So I think you could, variation on that same sort of theme. I remember a few years ago, Andre Gomes rather than Andre Gomez, But I think people look at, and it's funny because I always say, we don't do that with French. And if we had done that with French, we would never have spoken about Thierry Henry. We would have called him Thierry Henry,
Yeah.
And for some reason we do that with Portuguese. We don't want to make it more authentically Portuguese, which is a shame because it's actually very easy to do. And I think people follow along with us as commentators. And I think if we would just do that when a player first emerges, rather than, I think there is a tendency, and I do, hear this from colleagues in the commentary business, there is a tendency to feel that you're being a bit sort of bumptious by trying to say it in an overly Portuguese way. And my response to that is, no, it's not being bumptious, just get it right, And you don't necessarily have to try the Portuguese accent if that doesn't speak to you naturally. But there are sounds that we can make that would get it much closer. So I think pretty much a big chunk of, look at the Portuguese national team at any particular time, and a big chunk of those names are names that, as a commentary group, we could all say more authentically.
Okay.
All right. So before I go, I have one more names question. I want to ask you, what's the most difficult name you've came across that you had difficulty pronouncing, and one that you like a lot that you came across?
The one that for some reason always stands out, this is a name that I always had to think about 3 or 4 times before I said it. And it was when he began playing for Everton in England about 15 years ago. And his name is Diniyar Bilyaletdinov.
Oh, wow.
So if you can imagine, and it maybe doesn't seem that difficult, but when you're having to say it really quickly, ball comes over, Bilyaletdinov,
Yeah.
and then, the Diniyar in front of it, Diniyar Bilyaletdinov. Not easy to say quickly. So that's one I used to, before every game that I did when he was involved, I would say that over and over and over again just to be ready for it, because that is a little bit of a tongue twister. Of the modern names, I don't know. I think there are a lot of. I always enjoyed, because he was a great player, I always enjoyed being a German speaker when Bastian Schweinsteiger had a wonderful game. That was always one of my favorites. And I think nowadays I very much enjoy Dortmund's Nico Schlotterbeck. That's a great name for a German speaker as well. But there are always names that come up. I think that I would say you have to be quite careful with Korean names, because first of all, the family name, strictly speaking, goes first. So it would be Ray Derek rather than Derek Ray. And plus you have a lot of family names that are the same. So you have to learn the full name and you have to know it. So, you might, if you're covering Korea Republic, you sometimes might have 4 players whose family name is Lee or Park. So then you can't just go to Lee or Park every time they're on the ball. You have to have the full name.
Yeah.
So those are, I think every commentator would tell you on that basis, you sort of need to put in a bit of extra work on Korea Republic.
All right. Thank you. That was a very good insight. So the question I have for you is, your career brought you pretty early to the United States, and working with ESPN, you were commenting on the Serie A Brazilian games as well as Eredivisie games.
Yep.
Were there any talents you spotted early while you were commenting on those games that became, future world-class players?
Oh, yes. And this was the great thing. That era, so when I first moved to the USA, worked for the World Cup organizers in 1994 as one of the press officers, and then wasn't sure what I was going to do. Thought I might probably go back to Scotland. But ESPN came on the scene, and as you said, they immediately had rights to the Brasileiro, the Brazilian Championship, to the Eredivisie in the Netherlands, and to the Champions League, which was still in its infancy as a Champions League as opposed to the European Cup. And I have very fond memories of that period because I used to often on a Saturday I might commentate on Ajax, and the Ajax team of that era, you had players, who were still in their teens coming through the ranks, players like Clarence Seedorf, and you had Edgar Davids, and you had Patrick Kluivert, and you had, so I mean, that was a really rich era to be covering Dutch football. You could argue that Ajax team, and the record speaks for itself, probably the best team in Europe at that particular time, and Louis van Gaal as their coach. And then on a Sunday I might commentate on Brazilian football, and there we were really spoiled because we had people like Roberto Carlos still playing in Brazilian football. And I remember commentating a lot on who else did we have at that time? We had Edmundo, striker who was one of the best of his era. Going back to the Netherlands, we had Romario playing for PSV at that time as well. So it was quite a good time to be commentating on Dutch football and Brazilian football. And it's a bit sad that things have changed. That's why I was quite happy that the Brazilian teams did relatively well during the Club World Cup, because I think we forget about just how important that route is, that Brazilian route in football. And we all know about the Brazilian national team. We all know about the players who end up in Europe. We probably, as football fans, don't know enough about Flamengo and Botafogo in Rio and Fluminense and Palmeiras, who I mentioned, in Sao Paulo, and Santos. Pelé basically was Mr. Santos, and his story mirrors that of Santos. So I think it's been good to see that in the last few weeks that people are taking more of an interest in Brazilian football. But yeah, we got to see a lot of really good young players at that point in time in the early to mid 90s.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I knew during those times, those leagues definitely had some rich talent.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask that, and I'm glad you named some of the, the prolific players that eventually, became household names. So you were on the mic for Ghana versus Germany in the 2010 World Cup.
I was.
What stood out to you about Ghana's performance against Germany during that? And did you ever think they were going to go on to do what they did later on in that World Cup?
I remember that game. What I remember about that game, funnily enough, was it was a dark night. It was a dark, cold night in Johannesburg. And I'd been traveling up and down South Africa. And, you have to remember, it was winter in South Africa. I think that's the one thing maybe people don't take into account. So you had, I needed a big jacket. I remember having a big jacket on, commentating on that game at a time when people in the United States would have been watching in, shirt sleeves. But I remember in that game thinking that, and from memory, Germany had lost against Serbia, and Miroslav Klose had been sent off. So there was pressure on them. And Ghana had, of course, caught the eye. We had been talking for years. I mean, certainly since my first World Cup as a broadcaster in Italy in 1990, we'd been talking about African countries and who would be the first African country to maybe go all the way. And Cameroon, of course, had more than done their bit. We'd had great joy watching Cameroon, certainly when I think back to Roger Mila and that group of players from Cameroon. But there was a feeling, I think, in that World Cup that there would be an African country that would take off. But I remember in that game, Germany doing what they needed to do. It wasn't the best game of the World Cup, but I remember being particularly interested to see, what Ghana would do. And, of course, their dramatic football was to come. And it was, sadly, and I say sadly, a dramatic exit. When you think about the manner of the exit. And I don't think there was a football fan anywhere in the world who would have not had sympathy for Ghana after what happened, after the manner of that exit, and of course Suarez and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, as a Ghanaian speaking, it's one of my football memories that I don't think I would ever get over.
Yeah.
because we were right at the doorstep of this glory, and it all came crashing down. But between 2002 and 2009, you commented on a lot of games for ESPN, a lot of Champions League games, finals, semifinal games. What games or moment from that stood out to you, especially to be memorable during those times from 2002 to 2009 when ESPN had the Champions League?
Yeah, you're right. ESPN had the Champions League rights during that
Yeah.
period. Again, younger people probably don't remember it. But the
Mhm.
one that stands out and will always stand out for me, and I don't think it'll be topped in my lifetime, was the 2005 final
Oh,
from
wow.
Istanbul. So I went all the
Oh,
way to
yeah.
Istanbul. That was
Yeah.
Milan against Liverpool. And remember going there thinking Milan should really win this because Milan were the cream of the European crop. I thought they were the class act of European football at the time, personified by the great Paolo Maldini and players like Kaká and Shevchenko. And I thought they really should take care of Liverpool. This was a bit of a ragtag and bobtail Liverpool in comparison with the modern era and in comparison with the Liverpool team that I grew up watching and greatly revering. This was a Liverpool team that you would barely say that they were the fourth best team in England at that point in time. Somehow they'd made it to the final. There was, sorry, from the Chelsea angle, there was a certain win against Chelsea in the semi-final, and Mr. Mourinho for years afterwards called it a ghost goal. But it was given as a goal, and Liverpool made it. So anyway, Istanbul, one of my favorite cities. I have to say that to this day. It's one of my favorite places on earth. I think it's an absolute treasure trove. If you get the chance to go there, take it. It just it takes you back to a different time and place and has its own culture. Wonderful, wonderful culture, wonderfully rich. So went into this game, and of course, at halftime, it's 3-0 to Milan. And I'm thinking, yep, came all this way. It's going exactly as I thought, and I probably should have in my head what the biggest margin of victory is in a major European final, because it could get really ugly for Liverpool. But then, of course, they began to chip into the lead, to eat away at it. And before we knew it, it was 3-3 early in the second half. So from 3-0 down to 3-3, and you're thinking, okay. And I've never really covered a final like that, where you've had this big momentum shift on that basis, And I doubt I'll see that sort of thing again in my time as a commentator. And so, to cut a long story short, goes to extra time, and this fellow called Jerzy Dudek, who's by no means at that point anybody's idea of the best goalkeeper in the world, could be inspirational, but had clangers in his makeup as well, pulls off this remarkable double save to deny Shevchenko. We go into penalties, and we're thinking, okay, Liverpool might just do this now, and here's where the preparation comes in. We spoke about preparation. All of a sudden in this penalty shootout, Dudek starts doing this funny thing with his legs, this sort of jelly-legged, kind of moving his legs around in a sort of a weird way, trying to put off the opposition. And it's funny, I had watched as a younger person the 1984 European Cup final, in which Liverpool were victorious on penalties against Roma, and their keeper then, Bruce Grobbelaar, had done the same thing. So I remember saying it on air on ESPN. If you'd been watching on ESPN, you'd have heard me say, I said, I get the feeling Jerzy Dudek is taking inspiration from Bruce Grobbelaar and his jelly-legged antics from all those years ago. I actually said that on the commentary. And it worked a treat, because he kept denying Milan and ultimately Shevchenko to win the Champions League for Liverpool. And I remember at the time just being mentally exhausted after it all coming off the air, but also thinking to myself, we have really witnessed a special piece of history here, because that does not happen every day of the week. And it's funny, even to this day, I would say more than any other game I've commentated on, I have people who contact me on social media who might have been, I don't know, 13, 14, 15, 16, maybe college students at the time, who say that was their introduction to big-time European football. Maybe they'd come home from school and switched it on and saw this remarkable drama unfold and got hooked. Maybe they were at college and maybe there were viewings at the time of some of these matches. But
Hmm.
for some reason, I think it made a lot of Liverpool fans out of Americans, to be honest, as well. I think there are
Yeah.
many Americans who watched that game and said, I'm a Liverpool fan now, whether I like it or not. And so to have been a small part of that, obviously, as I said, the game is what's important, not what I said or didn't say during the game. But as a commentator, when you get that opportunity to commentate on an event
Mhm.
like that and put words to it, yeah, it's hard to top.
All right. It's great to see, somebody who was at the game and how, they were feeling during that time. So I have a question for you. I'm going to take you back a little bit, but this is kind of a two-part question. So the first one is you won Broadcaster of the Year in 1984.
Yep.
Did you feel like this was the turning point in your career? And as a freelancer now, what makes a project feel right for you?
87 it was, 1987, not
87.
84. Yeah, 87.
Sorry.
So, no, it's okay. It's okay. I was just 20. And
Wow.
yeah, it probably did. I mean, it certainly, my career it was on the up, no doubt about it. But a lot of people had taken interest in my story. I assumed just because I was young, because I was sort of a novelty act a little bit, there weren't many 19-year-old commentators doing the rounds. But what I discovered when I won that award at the age of 20, the UK Radio Sports Broadcaster of the Year, was that the judging panel didn't know that I was 19, because you couldn't just look people up on the internet. All they went by was the tape in front of them. So somebody at BBC Scotland had submitted it, and they had listened to it, and they had put me up against, 4 very credible sports broadcasters, 4 people who I idolized, who covered other sports. One was a cricket commentator, a very good one, Christopher Martin Jenkins. And I thought, I have no chance against this competition. But the head of the judging panel, who had a very plummy voice, said to me, he said, look, young chap, he said, we had no idea you were as young as you are. Very well done. We just enjoyed the tape. And so that was what they judged it on. And yeah, so, it obviously helped my career to have that award. And I'd started doing television at that point, and really have done television for 98% of my career, started off in radio. You asked the question about what makes a project interesting for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm at the point now where the project has to speak to me. So nowadays I'm in a very fortunate position. I don't have to take on everything. Somebody can offer me something. And what I will say is, and I know that this can't work for everybody, because we do, generally speaking, all have to make a living. The money is not the overriding factor for me at this point in my life. I would far rather take on something that I really like doing. Something that warms my heart when I do it, something that I really want to do, rather than getting a bit of extra money but not enjoying it as much. So this is really why I predominantly like to work in the German world, because it does speak to me on all levels. And I don't sweat the details when it comes to the money side of it, because somebody said to me years ago, another commentator who I greatly respect, said, if you always do what you're passionate about, if you follow your passions, then the rest of it will take care of itself. And I can only say that has been true for me, that by doing what I've wanted to do. I went back to work in Scotland in 2009 with BT Sport, when it wasn't necessarily the obvious career move. I'd already worked in Scotland for 5 years. I remember some people saying to me, are you sure you want to go back? It's a bit like sort of treading water. You're going back to nothing to prove there. And I said, no, I want to go back because I feel it's the right point in my life to go back home and to revisit and to tell some of the stories again. Been away for 20 years at that point. And through doing that, I had 8 very happy years back in Scotland with ESPN UK before BT Sport. It was ESPN UK first, and then BT Sport. So yeah, let the passion drive it. Obviously, we need to make a living as freelance broadcasters. That is the unfortunate reality. But if in doubt, always choose the project that your passion is about.
All right. Thanks for sharing that with us. Appreciate it.
No, that's a great perspective, Derek. To kind of close out, I have a few questions before we get into rapid fire. Just wanted to talk about modern football for a second. First place where I really want to start is FIFA, the game FIFA, now known as EAFC. The gentleman that's across from Cornelius to the right of him, the Chelsea fan, has been on the receiving end of a lot of games, a lot of FIFA losses. And you were there with us. You may not have known it, but you were there with us.
Absolutely.
So just talk about that experience. I mean, you're a part of one of the, if not the biggest sporting game in the world right now. What's that like to hear your voice on a platform where so many people are viewing it and listening?
Well, it's a great honor, first of all. I think that's the one thing anybody would say, being associated with the most iconic sports video game in the world. You have to be very lucky to be chosen, and I was fortunate enough to be chosen to be part of it back in 2017 when I was first approached, and I've been involved since FIFA 19, and now here we are on EAFC, as it's called, 26. I think you're conscious that it's a very different audience, a bigger audience, a younger audience, and probably in many cases an audience that's not familiar with the other work that you've done as a commentator. I often have to remind people when they contact me that, they'll say, well, where else can I hear you? And I'll say, well, Bundesliga. And how long have you been doing it? And I think a lot of people are flabbergasted when I say going on 40 years. Will be 40 years next year. But as I said, it is a great honor. And I think as a commentator on the video game, that you are sort of a part of people's footballing upbringing. That would be the best way to put it. And I often hear from people who say that they use the video game, people who don't speak English as a mother tongue, who use the video game to try to improve their football English. And I will say, well, that's a great honor. Now you've really put the pressure on me when you say things like that. I think it's one of these things that that when you do when you're a commentator on a video game such as I am, and this particular video game, that you're doing things that are still going to be there many years from now, because people can still play the old version of the video game. So, yeah, I don't take the honor, the responsibility lightly. And I just try to put my stamp on it, working with a great team, great production team, very talented audio team, and we collaborate. We try things out together, and sometimes it's quite off the cuff. At other times, it has to be more structured when we're looking at filling specific holes. But it's great fun. I come out of every session exhilarated, and you put your heart and soul into it. I'm conscious of the fact that you can't please everybody, and when you rub it in with somebody when maybe they've done something bad in the course of the game, and you're highlighting that mistake. I often get people saying, "Derek, you were not very nice to me last night. Not at all nice to you today.
Yeah.
That was way over the top." And of course, I have to say, "Yeah, I'm sorry. I wasn't in your living room. Had I been in your living room at the time, maybe I wouldn't have been quite as harsh." But I think that goes with the territory, and people do understand, and we try to make it as authentic as possible. And we've certainly, taken steps to that effect with regard to the new version of the game.
No, that's amazing. I mean, like I said, the biggest sporting game in the world, most definitely. So it's amazing to hear you on the game as well too. So like I said, Mike has been on the receiving end of a lot of those games. So
Sorry, Mike.
a lot of those.
Sorry, Mike.
What would be like one of your favorite lines that you said? I mean, you've said so many lines like in that. I mean, like, don't know what he was doing there or what he was thinking there. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well,
Like, do you have one that kind of sticks out to you?
Well, the thing is, I don't actually go back and I don't play the game very well myself, so I don't go back and play it. Sometimes I will hear other people playing it, and I want to sort of find out what works and what doesn't. I think in many cases, the best lines are actually the off-the-cuff throwaway lines. So things like that, what they will do is we might have, say, 10 missed chances that we have to do in a session, and I just come up with them off the top of my head. And sometimes it's one that just came from nowhere that I hadn't even planned on saying. And the production team will say, "Oh, okay, well, we quite like that. Put a star against that one." And before you know it, it ends up in the video game. There are certain lines, and for some reason this one, and I can't even remember in what context we first used it, but "Let's fly here." is
Yeah.
one that for some reason people keep reminding me about, keep saying, oh yeah, say let's fly here for us. Or there's another one actually you'll probably hear on the video game. This is one that really comes from the German context. And there's a tendency in Germany when something a bit strange happens, or maybe you missed a chance, where you'll say ay 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 ay,
Yeah.
and that one we've incorporated into the game this year. So you might hear that if
Okay.
somebody's clean through, must score.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ay ay ay,
Yeah.
so it's a way of kind of saying how on earth did they not score from there.
Yeah.
So things like that. But I'm always the thing people don't realize is that I don't know myself until the game comes out what has made the cut and what hasn't.
Okay.
So once the game comes out, I'll be able to know as well which things that we recorded are actually in the game and which ones are not. So it's always fun when the launch comes around.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. My next question is, Germany actually was one of the first leagues that introduced VAR when VAR was introduced to the game. What's your perspective on that, and how has that shaped or evolved the game?
I was a big fan of VAR when it was first proposed. I liked the idea of it. I thought that if we can get away from what Thierry Henry did against Republic of Ireland all those years ago with the handball, then we can all see that sorry, we can all see that that was wrong. We should have a way of correcting that. So I think it started off with the right intentions. I think we've gone too far with it. I think we're now at the stage where we are re-refereeing situations a bit too much. And it's especially frustrating when you're in the stadium. As I mentioned earlier, I often go to the stadium when I'm not working on a Sunday, and you are literally in the dark, or you have been until recently, not really knowing what it is they're looking at. And it's a bit of a downer, especially for the home team, when a goal gets annulled and you really have no idea why that was the case. I think it's improved a little bit now with the referee, certainly in Germany, this experiment whereby they announce their decisions in German. And I think this is taking root in other places too. But I would say I wish we could go back and sort of pare it down a bit and have it, fair enough, semi-automated offside. I think we can agree with that when it's a factual decision. But of course, offside is sometimes not just factual, it's also interpretation, and you'll have different opinions about that. Handball, I think, has got out of control, and we're at the point with handball whereby it changes every season.
Absolutely.
And we have a difficult job as commentators trying to convey to fans, because we get briefings from people in the refereeing business at the start of every season, and IFAB wants to change the handball interpretation every year. So if we're having to explain that every single season that there are changes, good luck. That's very difficult. And then these are coming into VAR decisions as well. So I think I'm in favor. I like the idea of getting it right, but I think we've taken it too far.
Before Salam, you ask your next question, I actually had a question about that, because we are primarily Premier League watchers here, and we watch in the MLS as well, but you see that in Germany they kind of get it right more so than I see in England, and with all these different leagues having different interpretations, do you ever think they'll standardize it? I mean, you kind of talked about the semi-automatic offsides, and we know about goal line technology and all that, but as far as standardizing it, because from Champions League to Serie A to La Liga to Bundesliga, there's all kind of different ideas of what's right. So do you ever think that it gets to that point?
It probably would be nice, but I think, unfortunately, cultural things come into it. I notice, for example, when I watch La Liga, there are free kicks given when those decisions would not apply in, say, England or Germany. There are just big differences there. I think for a long time in England, they were a lot more conservative with handball. Now they've sort of moved away from that. They're having to go with more of an international standard. I find it a little bit wrong when I watch a Champions League game and I see things there given that wouldn't be given in Germany. And I've even spoken to referees who've said, there's a slightly different standard in the Champions League. So, Yeah, I'm not holding my breath that we're going to have
Fair enough.
standardization. I think there will always be differences, subtle differences from one league to another. But I think IFAB would like it if they could get everybody on the same wavelength.
No, great question, Cornelius, and thank you for that, Derek. I actually wanted to keep it on England and Germany for a second. Just two questions before we get into rapid fire. You once called English football the corporate game. So I would love to hear you expand on that, and how does that compare to the authenticity that you see in Germany?
Well, maybe I would qualify that a little bit. Yes, there is a corporate game in England. I don't necessarily know that it permeates all levels of football. I think if you go down the divisions in England, you don't see the corporate game. You know, if you go to smaller venues in, say, League One or League Two, then it's a very different feel. Germany is much less corporate, and it has to be that way because of 50+1. So an oligarch can't come in and just buy up a club and make that club his toy, and the fans just have to deal with it. There are one or two exceptions to 50+1 based on historical precedent, but primarily that's the case in Germany. I think it's the one thing you do notice. I notice as a fan in English venues, the atmosphere is not as good. You know, it's just different, and you have a more corporate component within the crowd. You still have fans making plenty of noise, but it's just a different kind of vibe. And I think the Premier League has to be very careful that it doesn't lose the old-time atmosphere completely. And yeah, I'm slightly biased when I say this because obviously I work in Germany. But when people say to me, which English stadium should I go to first? I sort of look at them and I'll say to them, you don't want to go to an English stadium, you want to go to a German stadium first. And again, I do cover German football, so I do have a certain bias, but it's also based on observation. And I think most people who do it that way around, they come out of the experience saying, yeah, you were right. The German experience was more of an authentic football experience. You can lose yourself in the game in Germany in a way that's less likely in England. So I think that, again, it's money, and money talks. And, we all know that the English clubs have money to burn in a way that is not the case with German clubs. They have to be a bit more resourceful, a lot more resourceful. But that is modern football.
But
No, that's
just
great.
just really quickly, I do want to just for the listeners that don't know the 50-1 rule, can you just
Yeah.
explain that just really quickly for them?
Yeah, so in essence, 50+1 means that if you can think about the majority sort of ownership of a football club, essentially in Germany, what we mean by 50+1 is that the most that anybody can buy into a club would be 49%. So they can't come in and buy. So if somebody said, I want to go and buy, I don't know, Eintracht Frankfurt tomorrow, I really like that club, I want to go and buy them up. Well, they couldn't do that. Whereas in England, they can do that. And often it's a kind of a hostile takeover situation. Often it's done without the fans having any say. In Germany, we're talking about members' clubs. So the members have a big say. What do we mean by members? We mean the most passionate fans, and it doesn't cost a lot to be a member. It can be hard to actually get past the waiting list to be a member a lot of the time, depending upon the club. But the members essentially have a big say in the running of the club. And so they can look at what they might see as a hostile situation and say to that entity, no, you're not welcome. We're not going to support that. So I think once people understand it, they can see that it is what makes German football tick. That's why, because the fans have this big say, the ticket prices are much more reasonable. You can get into a German game, if you can get a ticket, it's quite hard, but if you can get a ticket, you can get in for around $14 or $15 standing behind the goal with the loudest fans inside the stadium. And that is part of the attraction. And that's by design, because there's a feeling that it shouldn't be a corporate game, that there should be a ticket for everybody. If you want to pay for the most expensive ticket, you can do that. But even that would not be anywhere near as expensive as the most expensive ticket in England. And as I mentioned earlier, you get your public transport in most cases as part of the match ticket. So imagine that. You're paying $14 or $15 to go and watch Borussia Dortmund. You're getting your public transport in the area paid, and that is to the game and after the game, and you can have a grand old time, and it doesn't cost the earth.
Oh, that's great. Great question, Gabriel. we're planning our European tour here soon, Derek. So
Great
we're
to hear.
definitely gonna we're definitely gonna have to pop over to Germany, man. It
You
sounds like
must. Oh, you absolutely must. You'll have a great time.
absolutely. You actually answered my second question. I was going to ask you about the differences between English football and German football, but you perfectly illustrated that in your response. So I'll close us out with some rapid fire questions. Favorite Bundesliga stadium?
Köln.
Okay. What could you expand on that? Just what about this stadium?
Köln is my second home, so it's not just the stadium; it's the city, it's everything about it. It's all things being equal, it's where I would spend every day of the year in Köln and Müngersdorf, where the stadium is. There's just a very special feeling of community there, and I think if anybody goes for the first time, they get it. They come out of it thinking, "Yeah, I see what you were talking about." It's maybe the friendliest city in Germany, has its own carnival culture, and so without hesitation, the stadium in Köln, Müngersdorf.
Okay. What's the most intense match you've ever called?
Most intense match. Well, mentioned that Milan-Liverpool game, but I would probably also give mention to the derby that I covered in Dortmund, 2017. Germany's biggest derby is the Revier Derby, as it's known, Dortmund against Schalke. And Dortmund were 4-0 up at halftime, running away with it. And a little bit like Milan-Liverpool, but the difference here is that Schalke kept chipping away at the lead, 4-1, 4-2, made it 4-3 near the end, and then Naldo, Brazilian defender, rose up, I'll never forget it, to head home the goal for 4-4 in added time at the end of the game. And I thought, that's what I said, this is why they call it the mother of all derbies. 4-4 in added time. Wow.
Very good. What's been one of the most challenging commentary moments you've had, technically or emotionally, and how did you grow from it?
Well, I think the most challenging would have been Euro 20, well, officially Euro 20, but it actually happened in 2021 because of COVID. And it was the first game that I was covering at that particular tournament. And it was Denmark against Finland.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you know what I'm referring to. So I was at the microphone when Christian Eriksen collapsed, and suddenly we went from covering a football match to, quite honestly, covering a very harrowing human story. And I was working with Efan Okoku that day, who's one of my favorite co-coms, great guy. And I think we just looked at each other and we didn't really know what to say or what to do. So we were told, stay on the air, just stay with you. You guys know how to handle this. And we basically commentated on this attempt to save Christian Eriksen's life for what seemed like an hour. I think in reality it was about 13 or 14 minutes. And I'll never forget it. I've never gone back to watch it, and I don't really ever want to go back to watch it and to listen to it. A few people said to me, wouldn't you want to go back and try to? I said, no, I lived it once. Luckily, Christian Eriksen survived. But I think every football fan who, had the TV on that day, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about and would hope to never have to go through that again.
Absolutely. No, that was a tough moment, definitely. Even just watching that live, I guess from our perspective, you kind of just didn't really know what happened. I mean, you saw him kind of just drop, and then
I think what we had to basically do, and Efan was great with me for this as well. I think we both realized we are now in a different commentary mode. We don't have a lot of information. We're only going by what you can see at home,
Yeah.
And obviously you had, medical people crowding around him. So I think we both tried to just hit the most empathetic tone that we could. And we both realized, and this goes back to what I said earlier about less is more. We both realized that the mistake that we could have made was to say too much, to speculate too much. Instead, just let it drift. Silence is golden in a situation like that. And come up with the right words, to empathize, because that's what everybody at home was doing. And there was absolutely no point in saying anything that we couldn't confirm with any real clarity. And nobody could confirm anything with any real clarity. And I've spoken to colleagues who, were on the same boat, who were commentating for other channels in different countries, and they've all said the same as me. One of the most difficult commentaries they've ever had to do. But we never quite know what the exam paper is going to be that day. So you do have to be ready, and you have to have the right tone and the right frame of mind, knowing that you're changing gear completely.
Yeah, absolutely. No, well said. And I think you guys did a very good job of
exceptional job. Yeah,
informing everybody, what was going on while still, keeping your composure. I think that's a lot of things. That's something that I don't think a lot of people quite grasp. And even just kind of hearing you talk about it, it made me think about, wow, like you guys, just like us, you're seeing that for the first time as well, too.
Yeah.
That's the thing about football commentary. I think that maybe people underestimate is that we're talking unscripted for 90 minutes, but at the same time, we're trying to talk with a certain authority. And it's quite a hard balance to strike a lot of the time. Somebody said to me, "Oh, isn't it just a bit like talking to somebody in the pub or in a cafe?" And I will say, no, because most conversations in a pub or in a cafe are pretty boring, really. They might be nice for us when we're involved in them, but they're pretty boring to most other people. So it's about finding the right tone and the right words. And yeah, that was certainly the challenge of all challenges. And as I said, probably a good thing that we didn't know what was coming, because you couldn't prepare for something like that. You simply have to sort of go into emergency mode as a commentator.
Yeah. Shout out to Christian Eriksen, man.
Yep.
Absolutely. I got 3 more for you. We're in stoppage time right now, Derek. So the first one I want to talk about is a player that recently is parting ways with the club that he was with, Thomas Muller, one of the icons in German football, one of my favorite players of this generation. Kind of just talk about him for a second and just like his impact on German football. As far as I could remember, I remember his first game, and like to kind of, go through his career, and for last season to be his last season, just kind of talk about his impact.
Well, I think in the modern era, there hasn't been a German player like Thomas Müller. And for somebody who is from Bavaria to have come through the ranks at Bayern like that, to pretty quickly become a hero, not just for Bayern, but for Germany. You think about all the accolades, all the Bundesliga titles, Champions League victory, World Cup winner. His CV is second to none. But I think you have to add to that not just the factual achievements, but the personality, Thomas Müller. And there are some footballers, whose personalities are very quiet away from the football pitch. Not the case with Thomas Müller. He has this larger-than-life personality. I remember when I first started covering him, and certainly as he got a little bit older, you would see him in the tunnel, and everybody else would look sort of stony-faced and tense. And, he's busy cracking jokes. He's busy going up and down the line of players and laughing. And you're thinking, this is a different sort of character, And he is, and he's somebody who is larger than life, somebody who always looked as though football was not a chore. Football was a joy, and playing for Bayern and for Germany, that was a joy as well. And, I was lucky enough to be there with him for his last Bundesliga game in Munich against Borussia Mönchengladbach. And I think we were all, as commentators, we don't hope for these things because we want the game to unfold as it unfolds. We were all hoping that Müller was going to, make his dramatic exit by scoring in front of the Südkurve. Didn't happen, sadly. But I just remember sort of almost having tears in my eyes when he walked off for the last time, because you look at all his appearances, 786.
Yeah.
There are not players like that nowadays. We're in a different era where players view different clubs as stepping stones and want to try something different. He never wanted to do any of that. until now, and it looks like he's going to end up in not just in MLS but in Canada playing for Vancouver. But he was a Bayern man through and through. I have no doubt he will have a connection with Bayern again in the future in some capacity. But I think that you can name the German greats and the Bayern greats, the likes of, pride of place going to Franz Beckenbauer, of course, Gerd Müller, Paul Breitner, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Sepp Maier, Oliver Kahn, you could say Lothar Matthäus, of course, and Thomas Müller. Where does he stand? Right at the top of that tree. Remarkable footballing figure.
Absolutely. Shout out to Thomas Müller.
Yeah.
United tried to get him many times, man, but he said nah.
He knew he was onto a good thing with Bayern.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I actually just saw an interview he did with Kate Scott, and she asked him that, and he was like, "Yeah, many times they asked me, but it wasn't the right move." But so one more before my last one. Just we're entering kind of a new, at least from my perspective, we're entering kind of a new era of the Bundesliga. Obviously, Bayern won the title last year, but you're seeing like a lot of new faces. You're seeing a lot of teams, emerging. You saw Bayern Leverkusen a season prior with Xabi Alonso and the work that he's done. Now Eric Ten Hag is there. I mean, we saw Vincent Kompany and what he did in his first season. And Borussia Dortmund always will be a mainstay, as well as in the League Two. Kind of, what would you tell fans to kind of look out for this upcoming Bundesliga season?
I think there will be plenty of stories. I think with Bayern, there's always a story because you have a new cast of characters. But you have in Michael Olise, I think one of the top talents in European football currently. An absolute delight to watch him. I mean, I knew he was good. I didn't know how good. That was his first season. And it doesn't always click for a player in their first season with Bayern. Sure. There can sometimes be a period of adaptation required. You have Harry Kane still there, scoring the goals. Sadly, Jamal Musiala is going to be out for a few months. That terrible injury that he suffered during the Club World Cup. But Bayern fans have Luis Diaz to look forward to as well. I think, though, with Kompany, what's interesting is he did succeed in putting his own stamp on the team. The style was much more progressive under him in comparison with Thomas Tuchel. It was much higher in terms of the line. That did leave them exposed at times against good counter-attacking teams. So it'll be interesting to see if they have refined that. And, of course, he's a coach who they took a bit of a chance on because didn't have a huge body of work as a coach, but they liked the way he presented himself and the way he presented his ideas. So I think Bayern will be very watchable, very attractive in the Bundesliga, in the Cup, and on the European front. But then I think the reason why it's interesting is Leverkusen, who you mentioned, they've lost Xabi Alonso, they've turned to Erik Ten Hag, and they've lost a whole cast of characters. They've lost a big chunk of personalities when you think about Florian Wirtz and Frimpong and Jonathan Tah and Xhaka.
Xhaka just left.
Obviously he doesn't want to stay. So there's a big rebuilding job going on there. And I wonder if it's all going to be sweetness and light for Erik Ten Hag. I think that is a challenging job. I think Leipzig will be better. They have Ole Werner, who was the Werder Bremen coach in charge, a coach I think very highly of. They want to get back to what they used to be, and that was signing younger players, playing this pressing style. They'd sort of got away from that. Older players, more possession, maybe didn't quite know what they wanted to be and missed out on Europe for the first time since they became a Bundesliga club. I think they will be better. Dortmund, the signs were good at the tail end of last season under Niko Kovac with a different style of play. He places a premium on fitness, so he'll have a chance to get the players in the right state of health for the new season. And I think we can take it as read. There'll be somebody else who will come into the picture, whether it might be Freiburg, who, again, were tremendous last season, or somebody from further down who will complicate the equation for some of the more established sides. And the
Mhm.
one thing about German football is the atmosphere is great at every game. And I think
Mhm.
people marvel at that. They look at a team that's in 14th
Yeah.
or 15th playing in front of 40 or 50,000, and that they could sell another 30 or 40,000, and they sort of ask, how does that happen? And well, we've explained earlier with 50 plus one how it happens.
Yeah,
All
absolutely.
right.
Thank you for that. My last question is, what's one piece of advice you would give to aspiring commentators that want to get involved in football?
The one bit of advice I would say is be yourself. Bring your own style to the microphone. Having said that, there are structures you have to work in. So listen to the commentators who you like and try to maybe write down what is it that commentator is doing that I like,
Mhm.
So then you don't copy them, but what you do is you take their sort of discipline and you make that work for yourself, but always have your own style. I've even heard a couple of younger commentators who've sent me tapes. I've even heard, and I've said this to them, I've heard them trying to sound a bit like me or a bit like another commentator. And I will say, don't do that, because you're going to be much better off if you be yourself. You are you. Be you.
Mhm.
Bring that, because it's always going to be better. If you're trying to copy somebody, then it's going to be a pale imitation. So be yourself, but listen to what the good commentators, as you might see it, are doing. Whether that is when are they pausing, when are they using their voice in an upwards inflection. How are they using their voices? What is their vocal range? How high do they go? How low do they go? But come up with your own style and your own words and use that structure and discipline, and that'll be to your advantage.
Very good. Thank you for that. Guys, you guys got anything before we close out?
Um,
Just
I mean, I don't know if this is a crazy request, but I would like to see if you could put our names in a commentary. I don't know. You've been the voice of our childhood, even now in our adult lives. I mean, we've heard your name on FIFA so many times. We've heard your voice on FIFA so many times. It's like it's almost unreal. This is all unreal. So I was like, hey, I would throw that out there just to see.
Well, it's funny you ask, because there are mechanisms by which this can happen. I don't know exactly how they happen, but I know that people from time to time are able to get their own name into the game. Sadly, for this year's edition, we've already finished the recording sessions, so there's nothing new that's going to go into the game. But maybe we can have a chat off air, and maybe one of these days we can find a way to get all your names in
EA,
there.
you heard that, right?
Yeah. Oh man, that's funny. Anyways.
No, but just
All right.
piggyback off
Nah.
Mike. It's been great to sit down. I mean, just like you said, hearing your voice and putting the face to it, it's it definitely meshes. And just hearing your story from Aberdeen and all about how
Yeah.
one thing that I really take from you is that you do your homework, and you're worried, you put a lot of onus on getting it right. Whether it's a name or the moment, you do really take responsibility in that. So I'm appreciative that you do, and can't wait to hear you this upcoming season.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for that. No, you're right. I mean, that is who I am. I'm a bit of a perfectionist, and I don't believe in going into a game knowing nothing and saying, "Well, I'll just wing it." That's not how I proceed. And sometimes, actually, the games I enjoy most are the games when I haven't done the teams before, because it does force you to to really study the stories and to want to bring those stories to life. And so, yeah, every game has its own music.
Absolutely.
absolutely. I just once again thank you. Even I mean, I've been playing FIFA for since I was, I don't know, 5 years old, and so all I can quote some of the lines that you said over the years. So I'm being completely honest, on the good end and the bad end. But no, just hearing the way you prep, how you're able to bring the stories to life, and then also just learning about how you really like to go into the depths with the fans. That really resonates with me, and you really want to get a sense and a feel for that fan base, that culture, that city. It really is inspiring to me, and all of us as young journalists and things of that sort. So once again, thank you again for your time, and definitely appreciate
Yeah.
it, and can't wait to hear all the new lines in the new EAFC 26 this year. Can't wait.
Absolutely.
Aye, 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 aye.
But yeah,
You
just wanted
probably will hear that now and again.
Love
You
it,
probably
love
will.
it, love it.
yeah, I just wanted to echo what the guy said. Again, thank you for your time. You're very generous with your time with us this afternoon. So we're really appreciative. We've been fans of you for a very long time. You've been,
Yeah.
a part of our footballing experience, and we just appreciate everything that you do. We've taken a lot of good gems away from your experience and things that we can apply to ourselves as well too. So just thank you again for the opportunity, and we look forward to listening to you on the Bundesliga this season. So
Well,
Yeah.
thank you all very much. And can I just say, I wish you all the very best with your own endeavors. I think it's great that you have this forum, that you're doing this regularly. And that's really what I meant earlier when I was talking about body of work. We all have to have that body of work. And this is as good a forum for that as any. So more power to all of you. And thanks a lot for the invitation. It was most enjoyable from my side as well.
Thank you.
thank you so
Wow,
much.
thank you.